On the 17th of January, 1966, four hydrogen bombs fell on Spain. Not in a war, not as an act of aggression, not as the result of any enemy action whatsoever. Four American hydrogen bombs, each one capable of destroying an entire city, each one carrying a destructive force hundreds of times greater than the bomb that obliterated Hiroshima, fell onto Spanish soil and into Spanish waters because two American aircraft collided in midair over the Mediterranean coast during a routine refueling operation. And for 80 days, the United States government scrambled to find them, recover them, conceal the true nature of what had happened, and convince a terrified Spanish population and a watching world that everything was perfectly fine, while privately confronting the very real possibility that one of the most catastrophically contaminated sites in the history of nuclear weapons had just been created on the soil of an allied nation. This is the story of Palomares. This is the story of Operation Chrome Dome. This is the story of the day America nearly lost four hydrogen bombs in Spain, and what happened in the weeks and months and decades afterward that revealed just how far governments will go to protect a secret when the alternative is admitting an almost unimaginable mistake. To understand how four hydrogen bombs ended up falling on a small Spanish fishing village, you have to understand the world as it existed in the early 1960s, because that world was a world living on the knife edge of annihilation in a way that is genuinely difficult to appreciate from the comfortable distance of the present. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 had brought the United States and the Soviet Union closer to nuclear war than any event before or since. 13 days during which the two superpowers stared at each other across the abyss, each fully aware that the other possessed weapons capable of ending civilization, and neither fully certain whether the other was bluffing. The crisis was resolved. The missiles were removed from Cuba. The immediate danger passed. But the lesson that American military planners drew from the Cuban Missile Crisis was stark and sobering. In the nuclear age, warning time is everything. If the Soviets decided to launch a first strike, the time between the launch of their missiles and the destruction of American cities and military bases could be as little as 30 minutes. In 30 minutes, the United States had to detect the attack, confirm it, make the decision to respond, and get its own weapons airborne or underground before they were destroyed on the ground. The American solution to this terrifying vulnerability was a program called the Strategic Air Command Airborne Alert, and its operational implementation was known as Operation Chrome Dome. The concept was elegantly simple and operationally monstrous. Strategic Air Command, the branch of the United States Air Force responsible for America's nuclear bomber force, would keep a certain number of nuclear-armed B-52 bombers in the air at all times, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. These aircraft would fly continuous patrol routes near the borders of the Soviet Union, loaded with nuclear weapons, ready to receive the order to penetrate Soviet airspace and deliver their weapons on pre-assigned targets at any moment. If the Soviets launched a surprise first strike that destroyed every American air base and missile silo simultaneously, these airborne bombers would survive, because you cannot destroy an aircraft that is already in the air. They were the ultimate insurance policy, the guarantee that no matter what the Soviets did, America would always retain the ability to retaliate. The Chrome Dome routes were long, extraordinarily long. A B-52 flying a Chrome Dome mission might be airborne for 24 hours or more. The aircraft could not carry enough fuel to sustain such a mission on its own, so aerial refueling was essential. At regular intervals along the patrol route, KC-135 tanker aircraft would rendezvous with the bombers and transfer thousands of gallons of fuel while both aircraft flew in formation at altitude. This was not a simple or risk-free procedure. Aerial refueling requires two large aircraft to fly in very close proximity to each other. The boom of the tanker connecting to the receptacle of the bomber, fuel flowing through the connection at high pressure. while both aircraft maintained precise speed and altitude and heading. In good weather, with experienced crews, aerial refueling is a demanding but manageable procedure. In bad weather, at night, in turbulence, with fatigued crews at the end of a long patrol, it is something considerably more hazardous. On the 16th of January, 1966, a B-52G Stratofortress, tail number 58-0256, lifted off from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. Its call sign was T-Ball 45. On board were 7 crew members, and in the bomb bay and on pylons beneath the wings, the aircraft carried 4 B-28 thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs. Each B-28 had a maximum yield of approximately 1.45 megatons. To put that in human terms, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima had a yield of approximately 15 kilotons. A single B-28 carried by T-Ball 45 was roughly 100 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The aircraft carried 4 of them. It was flying, as it did on every Chrome Dome mission, with enough explosive nuclear potential to end the existence of every major city in a medium-sized country. T-Ball 45 flew its patrol route across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean throughout the night of January 16th and into the early hours of January 17th. As it approached the Spanish coast near the city of Cartagena, it was time for refueling. A KC-135 tanker aircraft, call sign Troubadour 14, had flown out from Moron Air Base in southern Spain to rendezvous with the bomber and transfer the fuel it needed to complete the return journey to North Carolina. The rendezvous point was over the Mediterranean, near a town on the southeastern coast of Spain called Palomares. The date was January 17, 1966. The time was approximately 10:20 in the morning, local time. What happened next took less than a minute. The B-52 approached the KC-135 for the refueling connection. Something went wrong with the approach. The exact cause has been debated and analyzed for decades, with investigators pointing to a combination of factors including the B-52 pilot's approach angle being too steep and the closure rate being too fast. The B-52 struck the KC-135. The collision was catastrophic. The KC-135, with its tanks still nearly full of fuel, exploded almost instantly. All 4 crew members aboard the tanker were killed. The B-52 broke apart in midair. Of its 7 crew members, 4 were killed. 3 survived, parachuting from the disintegrating aircraft into Spanish territory and the Mediterranean Sea below. And as the 2 aircraft broke apart and burned and fell toward the Spanish coast below, the 4 B-28 hydrogen bombs went with them. Not contained within an intact aircraft. Not safely secured in a bomb bay. Falling freely, separating from the wreckage. Tumbling through the Spanish morning air toward the fields and gardens and fishing waters of Palomares. The people of Palomares, a small agricultural community of about 2,000 people, many of whom made their living growing tomatoes and other vegetables in the fertile fields along the coastal plain, saw the collision from the ground. They saw the fireball. They saw pieces of the 2 aircraft falling from the sky. They saw parachutes, some carrying the surviving crew members, some deploying automatically from the bombs themselves, because the B-28 was equipped with parachutes designed to slow its fall and ensure it reached the ground at a velocity that would not trigger accidental detonation. The sight of large metal objects descending on parachutes into their fields and the sea just offshore was terrifying and utterly incomprehensible to the villagers below. They had no idea what had fallen among them. They had no idea that their village had just become the site of one of the most significant nuclear incidents in history. The B-28 hydrogen bomb was a weapon of extraordinary destructive potential, but it was also a weapon with multiple safety systems designed to prevent accidental nuclear detonation. To detonate in its full thermonuclear yield, A B-28 required a specific and complex sequence of signals and events that could only be initiated by a deliberate arming and firing process. A bomb simply falling from an aircraft and hitting the ground would not, under normal circumstances, produce a nuclear detonation. This was enormously important. Because of the 4 bombs that fell at Palomares, none produced a nuclear detonation. The world was not destroyed. Palomares still exists. But not producing a nuclear detonation is very far from being harmless. 2 of the 4 bombs that fell on land, bombs 2 and 3 in the sequence of recovery, impacted the ground at high velocity when their parachutes either failed to deploy or deployed but became entangled. The conventional high explosives surrounding the nuclear core of a hydrogen bomb. The chemical explosives whose precisely timed detonation is what compresses the nuclear material to initiate fission, detonated on impact. These were not nuclear explosions. They were chemical explosions. But chemical explosions that involve the conventional explosive components of hydrogen bombs in the middle of agricultural fields have a particular and horrifying consequence. They scatter plutonium. The plutonium core of a nuclear weapon, when dispersed by a conventional explosion, does not produce a nuclear detonation. But it does produce radioactive contamination on a scale and of a type that is extremely serious. Plutonium-239, the fissile material used in nuclear weapons, is one of the most toxic substances known to science. It is an alpha emitter, which means that the radiation it produces is easily blocked by even a thin layer of material, a sheet of paper, a few centimeters of air, the outer layer of skin, and poses relatively little external radiation hazard. But if plutonium is inhaled or ingested, the alpha particles it emits cause severe damage to lung tissue, bone marrow, and other organs. Inhaled plutonium particles lodge in the lungs, where they continuously irradiate the surrounding tissue for years or decades. The connection between plutonium inhalation and lung cancer is well established. And in Palomares, on the morning of January 17, 1966, 2 hydrogen bombs had just exploded their conventional charges and scattered plutonium across the agricultural fields where local people grew their food and worked their land. The 3rd bomb fell on land as well, but its parachute deployed correctly and it impacted relatively gently, with no explosion of the conventional charge. It was recovered from a field relatively quickly. The 4th bomb, and this was the one that caused the American government the most immediate and prolonged anxiety, missed the land entirely and fell into the Mediterranean Sea. It sank, and for 80 days, the United States Navy could not find it. The American response to the Palomares incident was immediate, massive, and characterized by a systematic determination to control the narrative that would be studied in crisis communication courses for decades afterward. Within hours of the accident, the United States Air Force began coordinating with the Spanish government, specifically with the Franco dictatorship, which had a complex and transactional relationship with the United States that had included, since 1953, an agreement allowing the United States to maintain military bases on Spanish soil in exchange for economic aid and political recognition. The Franco government was deeply invested in maintaining its relationship with Washington and deeply alarmed by the implications of a major nuclear incident on Spanish soil. Both governments had powerful reasons to minimize, manage, and if possible conceal the true nature of what had happened at Palomares. The first official American statement about the incident described it simply as an accident involving an American military aircraft. The word nuclear was not used. The word bomb was not used. The American government's public position in the immediate aftermath of the Palomares incident was that an aircraft carrying unarmed nuclear devices had been involved in an accident. The nuclear devices, the public was assured, posed no danger. The devices were recovered. Everything was fine. This was not a lie in the narrowest technical sense. The bombs had not detonated nuclearly, and they did not pose a danger of nuclear explosion. But the claim that they posed no danger was, in the context of the plutonium contamination spreading across the fields of Palomares, a statement that requires charitable interpretation to be called anything other than profoundly misleading. The cleanup operation that the United States mounted at Palomares was, in scale and complexity, unlike anything that had been attempted before in a civilian context. Hundreds of American military personnel, working under the direction of the Defense Nuclear Agency, began the process of identifying and decontaminating the areas affected by the plutonium dispersal. Topsoil was scraped from contaminated areas and placed in barrels. Vegetation was removed. Fields were surveyed with radiation detection equipment. More than 1,500 barrels of contaminated soil were eventually collected, loaded onto ships, transported across the Atlantic, and buried at a licensed nuclear waste facility in Aiken, South Carolina. The scale of the contamination and the scale of the cleanup was enormous. And throughout the entire process, the Spanish population of Palomares was given minimal information about what was being done, why it was being done, and what the long-term implications for their health and the health of their land might be. The search for the missing fourth bomb was, in many ways, the most dramatic and technically demanding episode in the entire Palomares story. The bomb had fallen into the Mediterranean Sea, roughly 5 miles offshore, in water that was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 feet deep. In 1966, deep-sea search and recovery technology was in its infancy. The Navy had some deep-diving submersibles, the most important being a small vessel called the Alvin, operated by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. But these were experimental research vehicles, not proven military recovery platforms. Finding a single object roughly 11 feet long and 18 inches in diameter somewhere on the floor of the Mediterranean, in several thousand feet of water, without precise information about where it had entered the water, was a challenge that most experts considered at the outer edge of what was technically possible. The Navy assembled the largest naval search operation in its peacetime history. More than 30 ships participated in the search. Divers worked in waters as deep as they could safely operate. The deep-sea submersibles Alvin and Illuminaut were deployed. Underwater camera systems were lowered. Sonar was used extensively. The search area was systematically divided and methodically covered. And for 78 days, nothing was found. The bomb was not where the initial calculations suggested it should be. It was not responding to sonar. The underwater cameras showed nothing but seafloor sediment, rocks, and the occasional indifferent fish. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source. A Spanish fisherman named Francisco Simo Orts, who would become known in the Spanish press as Paco el de la Bomba, Francis of the Bomb, had witnessed the collision from his fishing boat and had seen the bomb enter the water. He had marked the approximate location in his memory in the way that fishermen do, by reference to visible landmarks on the shore. When American search coordinators finally sat down with him and carefully worked through his observations, his information allowed them to refocus the search area. On March 15, 1966, the submersible Alvin located the bomb. It was resting on a steep underwater slope at a depth of approximately 2,850 feet, its parachute still partially deployed and tangled around it, having apparently dragged it down the slope some distance from where it initially landed. It had taken nearly 3 months to find it. Recovering it took even longer. The actual recovery of the bomb from 2,850 feet of water, using 1966 technology, was an engineering achievement that the Navy and its civilian partners had every right to be proud of. It required multiple submersible dives, the development of improvised recovery tools, and an operation of extraordinary patience and precision. The bomb was fragile after its long submersion. Its parachute and associated hardware were tangled and degraded. The recovery required attaching a line to the weapon without disturbing it in ways that might cause it to slide further down the slope. After several attempts over multiple days, the bomb was successfully raised to the surface on April 7th, 1966, 80 days after it had fallen into the Mediterranean. It was brought aboard a recovery ship, placed in a sealed container, and eventually transported back to the United States for inspection and disposal. At the moment of the fourth bomb's recovery, American officials decided that a display of confidence was needed. The cleanup operation on land had attracted considerable international media attention. The contamination of Spanish agricultural land with plutonium had become a major diplomatic and public relations problem, despite the governments of both countries having worked hard to minimize public awareness of the severity of the situation. Spanish tomato exports had plummeted because nobody in Europe wanted to eat vegetables from a region where hydrogen bombs had exploded. The fishing industry along the affected coastline was devastated. Local people were frightened, and their fear was entirely rational. The American response to this public relations crisis was one of the more remarkable pieces of performative confidence in Cold War history. Manuel Fraga Iribarren, the Spanish Minister of Information and Tourism, a man whose professional role was, in essence, government propaganda, agreed to participate in a highly publicized swim in the waters off Palomares alongside the American ambassador to Spain, Angier Biddle-Duke. Photographs were taken. The photographs were distributed widely. The message was clear. The water is safe. The Spanish government says so. And here are two government officials swimming in it to prove it. The fact that the fourth bomb had been recovered from those very waters less than 2 months earlier, and that the cleanup of the land-based contamination was still very much ongoing, was not mentioned in the press releases. The swim worked, to a degree. It generated the photographs that the governments wanted. It provided a visual counter-narrative to the alarming images that had been appearing in international media. And it gave both governments a moment to breathe, a moment to present a face of normalcy and reassurance to a watching world. But it did not make the contamination go away. It did not address the questions that the people of Palomares were already beginning to ask about their health, their land, and their future. And it certainly did not address the question that would hang over Palomares for the next 6 decades and counting. What was the true long-term health impact of the plutonium contamination on the people who had lived and worked in the affected area? The health monitoring of the Palomares population that the United States and Spain agreed to undertake in the aftermath of the incident has itself become one of the more contested aspects of the story. A joint American-Spanish medical monitoring program was established, under which residents of Palomares who had been potentially exposed to plutonium contamination were periodically examined and their health data collected. The program was run in part by the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, now the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and it generated enormous amounts of data over the decades that followed. What that data showed, and what it was allowed to show, became a matter of significant controversy. Critics of the monitoring program argued that the data was interpreted in ways that systematically minimized the apparent health effects of plutonium exposure, and that American authorities had a powerful institutional interest in demonstrating that the Palomares contamination had not caused significant health harm, because admitting that it had caused significant health harm would open the United States government to enormous legal and financial liability. The people of Palomares themselves, the farmers who had worked in the contaminated fields, the children who had played in the contaminated soil, the women who had washed their families' clothes in water drawn from contaminated areas, had a perspective on the health question that was very different from the official one. In the years and decades after 1966, local people noticed what they believed were elevated rates of cancer in the community. They noticed that people who had worked in the most heavily contaminated areas seemed to develop health problems at higher rates than others. They noticed that the reassurances they had been given in 1966 and continued to be given for decades thereafter did not always match what they could see with their own eyes. And they began, slowly and with growing determination, to demand answers that the governments involved had spent 50 years being reluctant to provide. The story of Palomares is also a story about the broader context of Operation Chrome Dome. Because Palomares was not the first nuclear accident involving Chrome Dome bombers, and it was not the last. The Chrome Dome program had begun in 1960, and from its very beginning, the combination of continuous flight operations, aerial refueling, and nuclear-armed aircraft created accident risks that the Air Force and the civilian authorities overseeing the nuclear program were aware of but chose to accept as the price of deterrence. A year before Palomares, in January 1961, a B-52 had broken apart in midair over Goldsboro, North Carolina, releasing two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs. One of the Goldsboro bombs came startlingly close to detonating. An investigation found that 5 of the 6 safety mechanisms designed to prevent accidental detonation had failed, and only a single low-voltage switch stood between the state of North Carolina and a full thermonuclear detonation. The Goldsboro incident was classified at the time and not revealed to the public for decades, but it was known within the government, and it demonstrated clearly that the risks associated with Chrome Dome were not theoretical. And after Palomares, there was another accident, one in some ways even more serious. On January 21, 1968, just 2 years after Palomares, a B-52 caught fire during a Chrome Dome mission and crashed near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The aircraft was carrying 4 B-28 hydrogen bombs. The crash and the resulting fire caused the conventional explosives in all 4 bombs to detonate, scattering plutonium across the Greenland ice sheet. The Thule accident was, in terms of the scale of contamination, comparable to Palomares. It had the additional complication of occurring on the territory of Denmark, whose government had a policy, clearly stated and publicly known, of not allowing nuclear weapons on Danish territory, including Greenland. The revelation that the United States had been routinely flying nuclear-armed aircraft over Danish territory, in direct violation of Danish policy, caused a major political crisis in Denmark and contributed significantly to the decision by the Johnson administration to end Operation Chrome Dome entirely, which happened in 1968 following the Thule accident. The end of Operation Chrome Dome did not end the story of Palomares. The contamination remained. The people remained. The questions remained. And for decades, the efforts of the Spanish and American governments to fully address the situation were, by most independent assessments, inadequate. The original cleanup in 1966 had not removed all the contaminated soil. Surveys conducted in subsequent decades found elevated levels of plutonium contamination in areas that had not been adequately addressed in the original cleanup. The site continued to be monitored, but the monitoring was intermittent and the results were not always shared with the local population in a timely or transparent way. Successive Spanish governments and successive American administrations negotiated, argued, and occasionally made modest progress on the question of completing the cleanup, but always at a pace that the people of Palomares and their advocates found deeply inadequate. The diplomatic dimension of the Palomares story created tensions in the relationship between the United States and Spain that persisted for decades. The Franco dictatorship had managed the immediate aftermath of the accident in a way that prioritized its relationship with Washington over the interests of the Spanish population, and this became an increasingly uncomfortable fact as Spain transitioned to democracy in the years following Franco's death in 1975. A democratic Spain, with a free press and an independent judiciary, was considerably less willing to quietly accept American assurances that everything was fine at Palomares, and considerably more capable of asking the kinds of searching questions that the Franco government had discouraged. Spanish investigative journalists, environmental advocates, and eventually parliamentary committees began to examine the Palomares record in detail, and what they found confirmed many of the concerns that local people had been raising for years. The question of the remaining contamination came to a head in the first decade of the 21st century. A Spanish government study conducted in the early 2000s identified significant areas of residual plutonium contamination at the Palomares site, contamination that the 1966 cleanup had not adequately addressed, and that represented a continuing environmental and potential health risk. The Spanish government began pressing the United States, formally and with increasing urgency, to contribute to the cost and execution of a comprehensive cleanup of the remaining contamination. The United States, for its part, acknowledged the obligation in principle while finding various reasons to defer, delay, and minimize the scope of the cleanup that would actually be required. A formal agreement between the United States and Spain on the Palomares cleanup was reached in 2015, 49 years after the accident. The agreement committed the United States to helping pay for and execute a final cleanup of the contaminated areas. But even this agreement, hailed at the time as a significant step, has not been fully implemented. As of the time this story is being told, the cleanup is ongoing, the contaminated soil has not yet been fully removed, and the community of Palomares, now somewhat larger than it was in 1966, but still a small agricultural community on the Spanish Mediterranean coast, continues to live with the legacy of a morning in January 1966 when 4 hydrogen bombs fell from the sky and changed their world forever. The survivors of the original incident, those who were children or young adults in Palomares in January 1966, now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, have spent their lives in the shadow of that morning. Many of them have participated in the long-running health monitoring program. Many of them have watched neighbors and relatives develop cancers and other serious illnesses and wondered, without ever being able to obtain a definitive answer, whether those illnesses were connected to the plutonium that scattered across their village half a century ago. Many of them have spent years advocating, with varying degrees of success, for transparency, accountability, and a genuine commitment from the governments involved to address the harm that was done to their community. Their stories are the human core of the Palomares incident, not the geopolitics, not the Cold War strategy, not the technical details of the nuclear weapons or the aerial refueling accident. The human core of this story is Francisco Simo Orts, the fisherman who watched a bomb fall into the sea from his fishing boat and whose careful observation of where it landed ultimately led to its recovery. The human core is the farm workers who scraped contaminated topsoil into barrels alongside American military personnel and whose compensation for doing so amounted to some modest employment and some packages of food. The human core is the children of 1966 who are now the grandparents of Palomares, who carry the questions about their health and their land with them every day, and who have not yet, after more than half a century, received answers that feel complete and honest and sufficient. There is a deeper lesson in the Palomares story that extends beyond this particular accident, this particular village, this particular weapons program. It is a lesson about the relationship between governments and the people they govern, particularly in matters involving dangerous technologies and classified programs. The people of Palomares were not consulted about Operation Chrome Dome. They were not informed that American nuclear-armed bombers flew routinely over their village. They were not warned, after the accident, about the true nature of the contamination that had occurred in their fields. They were given reassurances that were carefully crafted to minimize alarm rather than to convey accurate information. And when the health monitoring program produced data that might have helped them understand their situation, that data was managed in ways that served the institutional interests of the programs producing it rather than the informational needs of the people most directly affected. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, the normal way in which governments have historically dealt with nuclear incidents and with the communities affected by them. The same pattern appears at Windscale in Britain, where a reactor fire in 1957 contaminated the surrounding countryside, and the true severity of the accident was concealed from the public for decades. The same pattern appears at Chernobyl, where Soviet authorities initially denied the severity of the accident, and the population of Pripyat was not evacuated for 36 hours after the explosion. The same pattern appears at dozens of less famous sites around the world where the development, testing, and deployment of nuclear weapons created environmental contamination and health risks that the responsible authorities were slow to acknowledge and slower still to address. The Cold War created a world in which the logic of deterrence, the logic of mutual assured destruction, the logic of keeping nuclear weapons ready to fly at a moment's notice, overrode other considerations in ways that were sometimes catastrophic for the people caught in the consequences. Operation Chrome Dome was, by the standards of the Cold War logic that produced it, a rational policy. Keeping nuclear-armed bombers airborne at all times genuinely did reduce American vulnerability to a Soviet first strike. The deterrent value of that capability was real. But the risk it created, the risk of accidents like Palomares, like Thule, like Goldsboro, like the dozens of smaller incidents that occurred throughout the Chrome Dome years and were classified and buried in the files of the Defense Nuclear Agency, was also real. And the people who bore the consequences of those risks were not the policymakers who designed Chrome Dome or the generals who implemented it. They were the people of Palomares. They were the crew members of T-Ball 4-5 and Troubadour 1-4 who died in the mid-air collision over the Spanish coast. They were the families of those crew members. They were the farm workers who scraped plutonium-contaminated soil into barrels with their bare hands. They were the children who played in fields that the United States government knew were contaminated and whose parents were told that there was nothing to worry about. The B-52 Stratofortress itself, the aircraft at the center of the Palomares incident, deserves a moment of reflection because the B-52 is one of the most extraordinary aircraft in the history of military aviation. Designed in the late 1940s and first flown in 1952, the B-52 was built to carry nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory. It was a massive aircraft, almost half the length of a football field, with 8 engines mounted under a swept wing that flexed visibly under load. It was designed to fly high and fast and far, to survive the journey to and from its targets in Soviet territory, and to deliver its weapons with sufficient accuracy to destroy the things they were aimed at. The B-52 that was involved in the Palomares accident was just 4 years old. It was a relatively modern example of a type that had only entered service in 1955, and despite the accident, the type itself proved extraordinarily durable. B-52s are still flying today, in the 21st century, more than 70 years after the type first flew. They have outlasted the Soviet Union that they were designed to destroy. They have outlasted the Cold War. They have outlasted Operation Chrome Dome. They continue to fly combat missions in wars that the people who designed them could not have imagined. The specific aircraft involved in the Palomares collision, both the B-52 and the KC-135, are gone, of course, scattered across the fields and waters of southeastern Spain on the morning of January 17, 1966. The crew members who died in the collision are remembered on memorials and in the records of the units they served with. The 3 survivors of the B-52 went on to lives that were shaped, inevitably, by the experience of having survived one of the most dramatic and consequential aviation accidents in American military history. Their accounts of the collision, of the parachute descent, of the landing in Spanish territory and the subsequent recovery, are part of the historical record of Palomares. The village of Palomares itself has changed enormously since 1966. The population has grown somewhat. The agricultural economy that defined it in 1966 has been supplemented by tourism, as the southeastern coast of Spain has developed into a popular holiday destination. New houses have been built. The children of 1966 have grown old. The fields where hydrogen bombs fell are still there, still farmed, still producing tomatoes under the Spanish sun. The contamination that remains in the soil is not visible. You cannot see plutonium. You cannot smell it or taste it. The fields of Palomares look like the fields of any other Mediterranean agricultural community, beautiful, productive, ordinary. And underneath the surface, in the soil that has been there since 1966 and that has not yet been fully cleaned up, the plutonium is still there too. Patient, invisible, persistent. With a half-life of 24,000 years, plutonium-239 operates on timescales that make human politics look ephemeral. Whatever governments decide to do or not do about the cleanup of Palomares, the plutonium will be there for longer than any nation currently in existence is likely to last. That is perhaps the most sobering fact in the entire Palomares story. The decisions made in the 1950s and 1960s to maintain nuclear-armed bombers on continuous airborne alert, flying over the fields and towns and fishing villages of southern Spain, created a contamination problem that will outlast every government involved in making those decisions by thousands of years. The politicians who made those decisions are dead. The generals who implemented them are dead. Kelly Johnson and his Skunk Works engineers, the weapons designers at Los Alamos and Sandia who built the B-28, the Strategic Air Command planners who designed the Chrome Dome routes, all gone. And the plutonium is still there. It will be there when every person now alive is gone. It will be there when the names of every government official who ever assured the people of Palomares that there was nothing to worry about have been forgotten. It will be there, in the soil of a small Spanish fishing village, for 20,000 years after the last nuclear weapon on Earth has been destroyed. If that fact does not make you think about the responsibilities that come with the development and deployment of nuclear technology, nothing will. If that fact does not make you think about the gap between the assurances of governments and the realities experienced by the communities they govern, nothing will. And if that fact does not make you think about the obligation of honesty that governments owe to the people most directly affected by the consequences of their decisions, the obligation that was so comprehensively failed in Palomares in 1966, and that has been only imperfectly honored in the decades since, then perhaps this story has more work to do. The Palomares incident is not a story from the distant past. It is not a historical curiosity. It is a living situation, with living people, with ongoing contamination, with unresolved legal and diplomatic questions, and with health questions that may never be fully answered because the data needed to answer them was collected by the institutions most interested in particular answers. It is a story about the present as much as about the past. And it is a story that deserves to be told, retold, and remembered, not to assign blame to individual people long dead, but to understand the systems and the incentives and the political dynamics that produce the decisions that produce the situation, so that those systems and incentives and dynamics might, eventually, be changed. The 4 bombs of Palomares fell 58 years ago. 3 of them were recovered relatively quickly. The 4th required 80 days and the largest peacetime naval search in American history to find. The cleanup of the resulting contamination is still not complete. The health questions raised by the exposure of the local population are still not fully answered. The diplomatic negotiations between Spain and the United States over the final cleanup are still ongoing. And the people of Palomares are still waiting. Waiting for answers, waiting for accountability, waiting for the completion of a cleanup that was promised 50 years ago and that has been advancing, with agonizing slowness, toward a conclusion that never quite arrives. They deserve better. They deserved better in 1966. They have deserved better in every year since. And the fact that they have not received better, that the most powerful government in the history of the world has found it consistently easier to delay, minimize, and manage the public narrative around Palomares than to simply complete the cleanup and provide the transparent health information that the community was owed from the beginning, is a fact about power and accountability that should disturb everyone who thinks about it. This is the story of Palomares. This is the story of Operation Chrome Dome. This is the story of the day 4 hydrogen bombs fell on Spain, and of the 58 years that followed, during which governments managed secrets and communities demanded answers, and plutonium, patient and invisible and indifferent to politics, waited in the soil for another 20,000 years. Remember this story, because the people of Palomares have been waiting for more than half a century for someone to remember it with them. If this story has moved you, if it has made you angry, if it has made you think, please subscribe to this channel right now and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. These are the stories that history books leave out and that the people who live them cannot afford to forget. Subscribe, share, and let us keep telling these stories together.